Everybody, I've been thinking a little bit about that great Beatles song from the 1969 album Abbey Road, Here Comes the Sun. And there's a little bit different version of the way that song was written in Eric Clapton's autobiography as opposed to George Harrison's autobiography, I Mean Mine. I wanted to talk a little bit about the writing of Here Comes the Sun. I hope you'll consider watching. Got my notes here. Well, I know everybody's heard Here Comes the Sun. It's such a great Beatles song. It shows how great a songwriter George Harrison was, and didn't write all that many songs for the Beatles. Of course, he was in there with Lennon and McCartney, and you got to give those two their due. But George Harrison, when he started writing some songs towards the middle and later part of the Beatles, definitely came up with some all-time classic songs, including Here Comes the Sun. It's such a great piece of music. But that was written at Hurtwood Edge at Eric Clapton's house. So it was kind of an interesting thing. I was thinking about that. I remember reading this. I read this a couple years ago, and I actually have a review of this autobiography on my channel. It's buried in some of these early videos I did. I started this channel during the pandemic because I couldn't go play anymore, and I've kind of enjoyed it. But anyway, one of the first things I ever did was review this autobiography by Eric Clapton. And I remember reading it at the time, how he talked about George being over and sort of them playing together, Here Comes the Sun. I wanted to share the two different accounts because they're a little bit different of how that song was written. Now, George Harrison says, Here Comes the Sun was written at the time when Apple was getting like school, where we had to go and be businessmen. So I guess it was kind of in the period when the Beatles were becoming big business and corporate, as we might say today. Anyway, it seems as if winter in England goes on forever. By the time spring comes, you really deserve it. So one day I decided I was going to sag off Apple, and I went over to Eric Clapton's house. The relief of not having to go see all those dopey accountants was wonderful, and I walked around the garden with one of Eric's acoustic guitars and wrote, Here Comes the Sun. Now that's George Harrison's version. So according to George Harrison, he was kind of down when, the Beatles were starting to have some of their more troubled periods, which often were about business. I'll imagine a lot of other things, personality and even the music, they were kind of quibbling about. But a lot of it, if you look at the Beatles breakup, a fair amount of it was about business. But he said he went over to Eric Clapton's house, which is Hurtwood Edge, and he was just kind of walking around. And he implies he was by himself. Now, in this book, in the Eric Clapton autobiography, see if I can read it without my glasses. Eric Clapton says, It was in the early days of Hurtwood that George wrote one of the most beautiful songs, Here Comes the Sun. It was a beautiful spring morning, and we were sitting at the top of a big field at the bottom of the garden. We had our guitars, and we were just strumming away when he started singing, Dee, it's been a long, hard, lonely winter. And bit by bit, he fleshed it out until it was time for lunch. So he's talking about George Harrison kind of, came up with the idea of Here Comes the Sun when they were playing together. But the one difference I notice is that Eric Clapton says they were playing together. And in George Harrison, he kind of implies they're playing alone. And I thought about that because songwriting can be pretty picky and litigious. So Eric Clapton, at no point does he ever say, hey, I co-wrote Here Comes the Sun. I deserve songwriter's credit. Actually, I think Nashville is full of stories like that. And, there are a lot of other stories in music of people who felt they were ripped off, didn't get songwriting credit. Eric Clapton never even comes close to that. He's very clear. I think he says twice in here, George's song. George started singing Here Comes the Sun. But he does make that little kind of... you could almost miss it, but he said, we were playing together and coming up with these chords. And then George sang, Dee, it's been a long, hard, lonely winter. But it sounds like they were playing together in that kind of iconic acoustic part kind of evolved with Clapton and George playing together. The third that is kind of cool in a way, because actually it sounds like Clapton and Harrison were kind of doing what Lennon and McCartney do so much, is if it kind of playing together and just kind of start singing. You can see that in Get Back, how they would just kind of play and a song would kind of evolve and someone would just start singing lyrics. And that sounds like what Clapton and George Harrison were doing. Now, if Lennon and McCartney had done that, they were playing together, kind of jamming, and maybe, who knows, maybe a couple hours. It was 1969. Who knows how long they were just jamming and playing. And they kind of evolved and morphed into that great acoustic guitar part. And, if Lennon and McCartney had done that, that would have been a Lennon and McCartney song. Even if maybe Paul went home and wrote the lyrics or vice versa, it would have been a Lennon and McCartney song. I think that's one of the reasons they always shared songwriting credits. It kind of looks good and it was iconic, almost a brand. But I also think that's because the two of them really did, when they wrote, they kind of played together as they wrote, and that was part of the Beatles' songwriting process that you see so much in that movie, Get Back. They wrote as they played, and those songs kind of evolved. And it sounds kind of like that's how Here Comes the Sun started. So George Harrison kind of implies he was playing by himself and just kind of came up with Here Comes the Sun. But Clapton said they were sitting there playing for a while, and then George started kind of singing, which is what the Beatles do in Get Back. They kind of play, and then someone sings some lines, and maybe they're kind of throwaway lines, but it keeps getting better, and you kind of hear it develop into something that sounds like it might be pretty good. But it sounds like Clapton had more I think I don't know if Clapton meant it that way. I certainly, who am I? I'm just speculating. But he does have that little line in here. We had our guitars out and we were just strumming away. So they were playing together when Here Comes the Sun was written, when it began. And then George kind of left Hurtwood Edge and by himself wrote the lyrics later, it sounded like. I think he wrote it somewhere else in the world. I dropped my piece of paper, so I lost my notes. But so I just thought it was kind of interesting, And I also thought of the Eagles, a word for a third. You change one, you make the littlest contribution to a song in the Eagles, you get a full split of that song. And I think that's how Nashville is. And that's also why Nashville is so careful not to let anyone else get near that song when it's being written. Which is too bad, really. And I actually appreciate Clapton. I don't think he was ever trying to say, hey, I wrote Here Comes the Sun, and I'm certainly not saying that. But it just is interesting to imagine George and Eric back in 1969 jamming on acoustic guitars, and the two of them kind of jamming and coming up with that great acoustic guitar part, and then George kind of just blurting out Here Comes the Sun, which is how John and Paul wrote. So George was kind of bringing in the Beatles' approach with Eric. And that was a period when Eric was trying to write more songs. He and George right around that time wrote Badge, right? That's a George Harrison, Eric Clapton collaboration. And even though it's a Cream song, George's name is on that song. So Eric Clapton, I think he only ever wrote about 30% of the catalog of all the music he's recorded. So he's someone I respect. He does a lot of other people's music and does it his own way. And then when he writes a good song, which he definitely does, he's always got a few of his own good songs on an album. But I just thought that was interesting that in this book, and I believe the Clapton version, they were playing together and for a while, kind of jamming, as they would say in 1969. And it was 1969, so they were playing a while, and those great chords kind of came out of the two of them, and that was the sort of genesis of one of the great Beatles songs ever written. And I think Eric Clapton, I'm just giving my own opinion on it. I think he had a hand in writing that song more than maybe some people think. I think everybody knows that it was written in Hurtwood Edge, but they started writing that song, and the feel, the mood, and maybe even the chords and the sort of little riff were kind of things that they played together, kind of like John and Paul do. And you see it in that movie. And I imagine that movie, John and Paul were kind of in the latter part of their relationship. I imagine if you saw them back in 1964 or 65, that's really how they did it. They just sat and played and played and played and kept singing whatever, playing whatever. And, you know, when they got something good, they just kind of keep playing that, and it would kind of evolve into something better. And, but it sounds like Clapton and George were playing, and that little bit of Here Comes the Sun kind of started to appear out of their two guitars, both of them together. And then George later wrote the lyrics. That's what it sounds like to me, and kind of maybe finished the chords. But it sounds like the sort of the gist of that acoustic guitar part was first played by George Harrison and Eric Clapton together, which I interpret to mean Clapton, you know, was part of the creative process that produced Here Comes the Sun. That's my 2 cents worth. We'll probably never know, but I just found it an interesting detail in this very good book. Thanks. God bless.